Hello. Thank you all for being here at the very end of the day. So over the next 50 minutes, we're going to talk about what it means to code without complexity. But to break that down a little bit, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and why I care about this problem. We're going to talk about what complexity in software development today does look like. Then we're going to do the fun part, where we're actually going to get to write code for a while and look at what the future might be like. And then we'll break down some of those concepts and talk about how we can be removing complexity from the systems that we're all building. So since it's the end of the day, let's keep in mind how we're feeling. I hope some of you are feeling like you've already had your mind blown and you have something that you're really super excited about. I hope you're feeling adequately like you've spent a bunch of time talking about programming languages and infrastructure. And I'm pretty cognizant that by 5:30, after listening to talks all day, I'm usually a little bit tired. What? Can you make the mic a little bit louder, please? I don't know how to. Is that better? No? I'm going to keep talking until we resolve our microphone issues. Is this loud enough yet? You have to tell me if it is, because okay, still no. Still higher. Okay, is this better? Or are we getting, now we're getting feedback. I do not know how to resolve AV situations. Is this, it's not changing? Okay, it's not changing.
They have it turned up as low as they
All right, is that better? Okay. Yes, people, yes, great. Thank you. Okay, from my side, this actually is quite a good transition. I'm happy to be here and talking to all of you, and I feel the normal amount of jitters that one feels when they're being attached to a microphone that they don't usually talk into. And so I started thinking about this a lot in my career, and as many of you as senior developers and leaders probably did as well, when I started spending less time staring at my laptop and writing code, and more time interacting with people. And when I was thinking about how to handle my own feelings and keeping track of them and working with development teams, I realized that I wanted to use the tool that I am most familiar with, which is software. And so I wanted to use software to fix this. And I sat down and thought, I'm just going to build myself a simple application. It will allow me to track my moods using emojis, which are what I use to track my moods anyway. It's what I send to my friends. It's how I think about it. And it was going to be pretty simple. I just needed to have a way to check in and some aggregation. And so I thought this would be an incredibly simple backend. All I needed was a persistent data storage, an endpoint to post check-in, an endpoint to get all my check-ins back, and an endpoint to run some aggregation statistics. When I sat down to do this over the weekend, it instead became a mess of lots of things I was interested in. I opened up Cloud Functions, I opened up the AWS console, there are 150 different options that I can think about, like we were talking about the panel this morning. Then I thought, okay, I'm just gonna go back to the way I would have done this a long time ago. I could get started in Rails, but Rails has an API generator now, and I'd be checking a bunch of dependencies and versions. But once I get this thing working locally, I still need to host it somewhere, so maybe I make a repo, and then maybe I run it on that cool new thing, Render. Oh, wait, but now I still need some data storage. And that's the problem. I really only want to do 4 things. I want to be receiving some data, processing data, storing and querying data, and sending data. And yet, somehow I end up in this mess where I can spend weeks and never actually end up shipping an application. And this seems wrong to be doing 4 simple things. This wasn't just in my side projects. In my previous professional life, I was a product manager for a long time. And infrastructure challenges came up across the board when we were working on things. And I think many of you will have faced the same problems. When I worked at Microsoft on Office Mobile, it was great because we got to sit between Office, Windows Phone, SkyDrive, and SharePoint. But that also meant we were thinking about a lot of different teams. And at one point, while we were building Office Mobile, SkyDrive decided to update their API, and we didn't have a formal agreement in place with them at the time. And so that meant that we actually ended up shipping a version of Office Mobile where you couldn't see all of your documents. You had to then open the SkyDrive app separately and be able to open those, all because it was so hard to change API protocols. And then I worked at Kickstarter, and that was exciting as well. There weren't as many problems of the previous type. But instead, what we had was we had our development environments, our staging environments, and our production environments. And pretty frequently, a lot of my work on backer experience meant having to check the checkout flow and understand how people were able to back projects and then process their payments. But unfortunately, frequently staging would get out of date and there would be no live projects that you would actually be able to back. And so then as a developer, you would spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, how do I go move a bunch of stuff from our Redshift system so we can have projects that are live on staging again, taking time away from thinking about, okay, all I want to do is actually ship this improvement to the checkout flow. And then I worked at Lola, a travel management company, and it was really important to us that our infrastructure worked well and it was scalable. We knew that when we launched the product, we wanted to have it ready for a large number of users right away. I'm sure some of you have run into this problem before as well. And so we decided to shard our databases, which seems like a good investment until we got to the point where we realized the core unit of our customer wasn't actually on the individual user. It was that we were going to be a B2B travel management platform. And so now we had these challenges where we sharded on the wrong thing, and it was, are we going to re-architect everything, or are we just kind of going to keep cobbling this together? And so the really upsetting thing about this is I feel like our general attitude within the industry is it's got to be like this, and it's going to be hard. Fred Brooks wrote his essay in 1986, No Silver Bullet, saying, until we get to the point where most of the things we're doing in software don't actually matter, we're not going to be able to make things an order of magnitude better. Because right now, most of the code we write we need, and sure, we do a little bit with memory management or garbage collection that's about the device that we're running on, rather than what we're actually trying to serve. But it's not so much that we can get an order of magnitude better. I think things have changed a lot since 1986. And one of the big ways that they have is that now we're all primarily running on distributed systems rather than just writing our code that runs locally. And when we did that, we kept up the same mentality that we'd always had for software development. When we think about the first tenet of the Unix philosophy, it's make each thing do one thing well. And that's what we still do. When we're adding tools to our ecosystem, we make a tool that solves one problem for us and does one thing well. But where that's gotten us to is we've actually gotten to the point where we are spending a lot of time, and all of you and your teams are spending a lot of time on the things that we don't want to be. Stripe released their developer coefficient report in 2018, saying that nearly half of the time we're spending as developers is on dealing with bad code, debugging, refactoring, and modifying, rather than delivering new business value. And so when I look at that, that really seems like we have gotten to this place where it's no longer a world of 1986 where there's no silver bullet. We have accidental complexity absolutely everywhere in things we're doing. And so that's a little vague, so let's break that down into 3 categories. In particular, accidental complexity in software development today falls into 3 buckets. The first one, the one all of us in this room probably think about a lot, being infrastructure. The second one being deployment, and the third being APIs, and specifically how we talk to external APIs from within our applications. Infrastructure-wise, have we seen this map before? My favorite thing about this diagram is that at the top, it has a little note that says, overwhelmed, please see our other map, even though this is meant to be an overview. I think a lot of you in this room probably actually know more of the things on this slide than I do, but I think very few people don't feel overwhelmed when faced with 400 choices of technology they could use when trying to move to a cloud-native infrastructure. The thing about this is, if we go back to our beginning of we're just trying to receive and send and query our data and store it somewhere, yes, these things sort of help us solve these problems, but they aren't one thing that lets us do all of that. It's this giant ecosystem just to do those 4 simple tasks. When we think about deployment, I enjoyed the joke earlier that if you ask 10 people on a team how something gets to production, you will get 11 answers, which I think is true. Similarly, coming from a product background, a common interview question to see if PMs were technical enough was always, what happens when you type a URL into your browser, and how do you get a response back? I think a more appropriate question today would be the same one of how do things that your developers that you're working with write get into production? And so when you think about this, really all you're trying to do is ship something, and to think about how you're shipping it, you have to remember these 34 different steps that you're going through, and someone has to maintain and think about this. And then APIs. APIs used to work just like function calls, and I don't know about all of you, but today when I'm building with APIs, I end up having one thing up with all of the documentation, and then my command line up so I can do a bunch of curling, and then probably another API tool to be able to inspect things, and then a whole bunch of other stuff that I end up needing for some reason. And so today, it no longer works just like a function call. We end up in this world where we end up having to use a bunch of tooling just to do something simple, like talk to an external service. And so that's what I want to think about, is what happens if we don't think about these things? What if we don't need that slide of 400 things? What if we don't need a 34-step deployment process? And what if APIs, once again, are like calling the native functions from within a language? And so that's what we've been doing with Dark. Over the last 2 years, we've been building a holistic language editor and infrastructure for doing this. I'm going to show you what that's like from the perspective of what does it mean to put all of these things together at once, but then we'll go back and talk about how some other tools are doing pieces of that. Since this is a language track, I know that everyone always wants to get into the nitty-gritty of what is the syntax of this language and how does it work. And so before we actually demo things, it looks like a normal language. It just looks like code. This is a question that many of you may have been forced to answer at some terrible part of your life. But from the perspective of this, Dark looks like any other language. You have conditionals. The language itself is functional. OK, but with that in mind, let's actually write code and talk about what a world without accidental complexity looks like. OK. Yes. First thing, you will note that I am entirely in my browser. I have not done anything special for this demo before I got here, except I did pull out. I'm going to de-zoom myself once. Yeah, that'll work. I did pull out all of my tokens that I'll be using during the demo into functions, so I would just be able to call them and not show you all of them. So first thing, in Dark, when I'm setting up a new API endpoint, all I have to do is specify my route, which I've somehow lost, the method it is responding to, and my response. And so this is now up and hosted. You could actually all go to it from your phones if you want to. And so rather than my process before when I was thinking about setting up a simple mood tracking application and then spent hours trying to figure out how to configure infrastructure and got down my rabbit hole of all of the tools, I have something that's just up and it works for me. If you're wondering about how this works under the hood, it's actually a very standard thing that you would build for yourself under the hood. It's running on GKE, and the data stores are in Postgres. And so then if I want to, say, make slightly more, oh, yeah, so you go. Those are, whoever in the room has just visited this endpoint. Apparently there are 4 of you who did not believe me and checked it out. Thank you for that. I actually enjoyed that. And so then if we change this, actually, we'll do it. You can do this. Ooh, many more of you. There'll be like 15, and then it'll start getting rid of some of them for me. And so then if I say change it and want to greet visitors by name, I can add a URL parameter. I will say hello to QCon. And you can see that my response is still updating. And now some of you can greet yourselves, not Paul Kimbrell. Hello, not Paul Kimbrell. And so the cool thing about this is we can now see what our expression evaluates to for the current trace coming in. Let's see, let's grab another one. Tyson, that's a little bit easier. And I think one of the things, I don't usually show this in demos, but since it's this audience and I think this is fun, if we wanted to make a change to this code, and since we're writing live right now, obviously you wouldn't want, if you had a bunch of end users, like right now yourselves, looking at your application, you wouldn't want things to just change without intentionally making the decision. So in Dark, I can add a feature flag. I can name it, like we'll just change greeting. And then we can set a condition. And so we'll change it, say, only if the name is mine. And then, I don't want all of you to be able to do this. And then we'll just change it to be hi instead. And so now when I go back over and I greet myself, I get hi, Ellen, but the rest of you are still getting hello to whatever endpoint you wanted. And so from this perspective, we've moved from this idea of I have an environment where I'm writing locally, and then I'm shipping to staging, and then I'm shipping to production, to my application is working on production, but I am still doing all of my changes behind feature flags, so I won't be creating a bad user experience. All right. That aside, what does this mean when you're building a real application instead of something that just means saying hello world? You're just really excited about this. You're the best audience I've ever had. No one ever does that. So let's make a new one where what we're going to do here is frequently when we're developing, we have some piece of our application already built. In this case, a front end. And so what I'm going to do is I have a sample front end that I built ahead of time. It's a React application. If you want to see the code, it is not very interesting. And all that I've done in here is that I've set my API host to be pointed at Dark where we're using it. and then I used a command line app to upload it to where we were working. And so this is what that looks like. And you can see that because we're actually working live, we get this 404 back. And instead of doing what we would usually do while developing, which I find to be extremely tedious and slow, and having to go inspect and figure it out, and then figure out, OK, our host's endpoint failed, and then go build that, and then deploy, and then hope that works, we're actually hooked up to it already. Close my DevTools. So what I can do is when I go back into Dark, I can see that this endpoint is failing and create that endpoint directly. And so I'm building based off of what my application needs from the front end and from the end user experience, rather than having to do a bunch of stuff and see if it works. And then we can actually try it out. If I add real data, I can go back over, and I have this here. Again, one of the things that seems a little bit silly about this demo is it feels like it's a toy application because it's relatively small, which is what you have to do to get it to work for this. But I want to make it as real as possible. So instead of just having a host endpoint, let's actually make a real data store. Let's give our hosts names and phone numbers. This way we can tell them when people are visiting them. And the other piece of this is now we want to be able to put someone into this data store. And normally I would have a bunch of database tools that I'm using with some database that I had to go set up completely separately from my browser. In this case, I can just make my tool side by side. And it'll work exactly the same way my HTTP handlers are working. And so what I can do is I can add myself. This is my real phone number. Sometimes I edit that out, and that is. And so then what I'm also doing, I just had this on my clipboard. This is my Slack ID for our company Slack, so we'll be able to send me actual messages. In Dark, it's a little bit hard to tell while I'm typing. You're editing an AST, which is part of what makes us know you won't break your production infrastructure. And so when you have this, you can actually do a bunch of cool stuff because it knows you're not just editing text. I think there was a comment earlier about infrastructure is text first code, and this is very much not just text. So I'm going to extract this so I can reuse it. And so actually, let me do this. So if I pull my same variable out here, and then I rename it, I get all of the nice auto-renaming stuff that you might get, which I think is very nice as a part of the built-in language. And so then, last piece, put this into the data store. Same as before, how we could see the results of our incoming traces that were coming in. Hello, Pika. We can choose to execute functions that have side effects. And so in this case, if I want to insert something in my data store, I can do that. And as soon as I've done so, my data store locks. Same thing with the handlers and needing to edit live code behind feature flags. If you have real data in your data store, you want to be running a migration. All right, so now that we have that, we just need to quickly edit our endpoint to be getting all of the hosts out. So we can do the same thing here. We can run it, see what it is. We don't actually need every single host, so we can pull just their names. There that is. It'll be just me. When we go back to our front-end application, that works. And if we check in as QCon, same flow. Make my visits endpoint, and then we will work with that. And so here we go. The interesting thing about this is since we've passed in real data, we have it available to us. We have Dude here, who has apparently already checked in. And what this, what this means is that rather than having to guess at the shape of our objects, we know exactly what they look like as we're doing it. And we can just generate a new key and make our new data store, which is going to have the same shape. And so then I can double check this. So if I make this visits, I get this relational link to my visits data store. I can go back and forth between them if I want. But the interesting part about this is then I can compare that easily to the shape of the requests that I have coming in. In the future, you'll be able to use these to generate types and use types as the background. So again, we will run our request, and we can see that that is now also locked. And last piece of this, right now, technically, if you go check in, it'll work. You'll get a confirmation because you're getting a return value. But I said I wanted to show you what it might look like to be easier to operate with APIs. So let's do a little bit of that. In Dark, there is a built-in eventing system. And so I can emit the request I got to be able to send a text message in a worker. And then same thing. We'll emit the same event to be able to send a Slack DM. So let's do the text message first. And you can see once I execute them, it basically makes a to-do list for me. And so when I'm doing my send text, much like I had, ooh, that's mean. Much like I had the, I don't think it's going to matter at all. But much like JC, thank you, JC, you're a nicer person. Much like I could work with my requests directly in my HTTP endpoint, I can work with my events directly here. So I have my host name, and then let me get my host back out of my data store. And then again, we can run this and check that it works, which it does. And you can see that I really have this feedback loop all of the time because I have this data where I can make sure things are working the way I want them to. And then I want my host's phone number. And you can see here I get that autocomplete for the fields like any modern editor. And then last piece of this, I want to be able to send the host a text message to say that they've gotten a visitor. And so in Dark, I can just call Twilio send text. I will pull in my SID. This is the thing I showed you that I pulled out before. And we are going to send it to me, the host phone, and we're going to say event.visitor is here to see you. And so now is the point where you actually get to start sending text messages to my phone. The cool part is, much like we ran our DB query functions before, we can use the same thing with our API endpoint, run it, and then see the message. And in this case, we actually get an error, and it's because I used the from number wrong. Oh yeah, that was actually really great. So now it's easier for me to debug because I can see the from number is this thing, which is not what it should be. It's because I put my SID there again, run my text message again, and I should get a text that says JC is here to see you. And I have a text on my phone. The iMessage syncing between one's phone and one's computer leaves a little bit to be desired. So similar, you're not going to have every single API wrapped in a language out of the box. And so with Slack, I haven't done that yet. So I'll show you the equivalent experience when you're using when you are using the HTTP client library instead. It's basically the same. Copy paste works by expression, which is another nice thing. I somehow lost something. There we go. And then what we want is our channel, which will be our host.our/Slack ID. Run this, make sure we actually get this back. We do. And so in this case, we're going to want to build a header. So token, Slack token I also pulled out ahead of time. The API we're using, we're going to want to use the JSON content type, so we'll do that. Nice thing about this is we end up with a nicely formatted header. And so then last piece, let me just pull out the URL. Post message. And so now it should be client post URL token Slack token channel text event.visitor is here to see you. Won't worry about, it's fine. We'll make this empty, and we already built our header. And so same thing, we've now integrated with an API from scratch using an HTTP client library rather than having a nice wrapper. And when we do this, we will get a bot message that select star from hosts is here to see you. So I'd say that seems to be working for us. If I go over here, we do. And this is cool, is here to see me as well. Thank you. And we can also see we have pending events coming in that we'll continue to process as people visit the web page and use this. But for all of you who are not sitting there following along and resubmitting names over time, if I do this, I will get the confirmation. I will receive both a text message, although probably not, and also a Slack message. And so I wanted to show you that not because I love building Office sign-in applications, although I seem to do this a lot now, but because I think that's the power when you take away all of the complexity at once, is you go from something where you would be spending way more than 10 minutes just to get an environment set up to being able to ship a working, somewhat functional clone of what would have been an early stage Envoy or other Office check-in system startup. And so projects go from being something that you need to spend a ton of time thinking about to being something where you can just spin it up and try it out and work with it whenever you want, whether it's a prototype or something you want to continue to work with. And so let's hop back over and talk about that a little bit. So when we're thinking about no accidental complexity, it's just what you saw. It's that you're getting compiled infrastructure where you aren't thinking about it as you're writing code. You are getting an environment that I call deployless, much like when we talk about serverless, there are still servers. With deployless, there's still a deploy. It just happens in the 50 milliseconds after you type and before you can switch back to see what happened. And you have something that acknowledges that the world that we're all developing in today is really focused on all of these external services and connections that we need to make. And so let's look at what each of those pieces is compared to what we have today and some of the other ways people are approaching this as well. So infrastructure complexity, a thing we probably all remember as being a giant slide of many services we can use to be able to do our basic needs for backends of sending and querying and receiving data. We really have boiled down into a super small set of core use cases. I showed you 4 of these, but not the 5th. But when you're building something without accidental complexity, you're thinking of, what is it that I want to be doing? And it might be that you are having a persistent data storage. It might be that you are running something on a schedule, cron. It might be that you have a background worker that you want to be responding to events. It might be an API endpoint, or it might be some sort of tool that you're using. I would encourage you to think about the applications you're building and figure out how many things you're doing can be boiled down into these categories or don't. And if you have a bunch that don't, I would be interested to hear about them, because I found that most of my projects and most of the work that I have done over time is really a core set of services that I'm working from. This might seem familiar if you've used other popular products like AWS Lambda. And so when you're thinking about this, even though Lambda technically has many, many options of what you can do, if you really think of it as the core of being your code runs on a trigger, you can also connect that trigger to be based on time, or you can connect that trigger to be based on an HTTP endpoint. You end up at a very similar set of core functionality that you're able to set up and keep working with. Second part of this, one of the things we didn't talk about very much while demoing, but is interesting, is when you have a bunch of independent services like this, it becomes really important to know how they connect to each other. I don't know how many of you have started a new job recently or have hired someone recently, but I feel I spend a lot of time going to whiteboards and drawing out a diagram of this is how our code really works, because you can't just put someone in front of their text editor and say, here's the file structure. That's not how people learn. That's not how people think about the impact they're building. And so by having your infrastructure work like this, you can end up having something where you can see all of the connections between what you're building and how they relate to each other. In modern infrastructure technology today, a lot of other people are trying to build systems like this. Cloudcraft is one example, where you have a system that allows you to monitor how your infrastructure is connected together and how your services are interlinked. OK, that's the big one. Then deployment complexity. We talked about this before. This is the big scary one. Right now, we have these deployment pipelines where most of the people on our teams don't necessarily know how the entire deployment pipeline works, and we keep adding more things in the name of adding safety or hopefully making things better. But every time we add something, it's another thing for people to think about, or it's another couple minutes they spend not being able to deploy. I spend a lot of time at Friday retro meetings with people who are going, just has to get through CI, and then it'll be there, and then we can see it. And that comes with a real cost. Of course, I just showed you this and how it works. In Dark, you can just deploy immediately. The scary thing about this is the fact that it is live and you're on your production infrastructure, and that feels weird. And so I think the really important thing to think about here, and that I would encourage all of you to think about and think about adding to your team, is when we came up with the idea of having development environments and staging environments and production environments and creating safety by separating out where things live, we didn't have the modern best practices of having feature flags. That was really the only way we could control who was able to access things. And now that we have feature flags, that's a great way to control who is able to access things. And there's still limitations here. We get a bunch of extra safety out of features in the language where we can deploy, and it's less scary. But from the main perspective, if you can set it up so the default action for thinking about how you're delivering to a user is behind a feature flag rather than behind your environment, you're actually thinking about the thing that matters. Like, none of your users care about if something is on dev or staging or prod. They care about, can I see it or not? If it's on prod and they can't see it because it's behind a feature flag, that's fine. It's not there for them. And then similarly, that causes less risks for you. the longer you let something bake in dev and you have this giant pull request that's sitting on your machine that isn't out there, the more likely it is that it's going to be hard and you're going to have a bunch of merge conflicts when you get it in. The longer something ships in staging, the more secure people will think they feel about it because they've been testing it for so long. But staging isn't necessarily a proxy for the real world. Same thing as when I was talking about Kickstarter and not ever having live projects on staging. That means it's a very different place than the live Kickstarter site. And so if you can work towards the world where your primary thought about what is safe in your deployment process is operating behind feature flags, you've gone a big step towards not having to think about as much of this deployment complexity. I'm going to skip that since we already talked about it. And I would say that one person who has spent a lot of time thinking about this in the modern ecosystem is LaunchDarkly. And they are specifically a feature flag provider. And so if you are trying to say, OK, let's spend less time on this deployment part and more time investing in feature flags, this is a great example of a provider who's really focused on that. Last one, API complexity. So again, my experience of APIs, opening many things to try to get something to work, and it works in a terminal or it works in your API test provider, and that doesn't work when it actually gets into your application. Plus, when it's actually in your application, then you need a bunch of stuff for backoffs and retries and all of those other things you need to get it to work. One of the things that's nice about having an environment, and particularly a language, is you can start to compose APIs such that you take more and more away from what individual developers need to use. And so there's the basic. You can talk to any API through a REST request for the most part and use HTTP client post. But you could think about how you could build internal tooling for developers at your company such that they would be able to call them much more closely to functions like the Twilio syntax I showed you. And the extension of this, if you want to go a step even further, is depending on the teams and their different needs, is you could even pull out your secrets and your credentials into another place so that developers are only really thinking about what is the phone number I'm sending a text to and what is the text that I'm sending, and not necessarily thinking about the actual configuration around the other requirements for the API. A company that's spent a lot of time looking at this space, and particularly the space of being able to think about, I just want to get this API up and running, is Transposit. If you just want to play with it, they have a really fun sample where you can have your Google Calendar linked to your Slack very easily using a minimal amount of actually writing code. And it'll say, OK, if you have vacation on your Google Calendar, I will set your Slack status to being away. And so people are really trying to move towards this world where we're not all writing the same logic for handling these external APIs. We're instead able to write the stuff that we care about. Last piece of this, which is kind of cheating. My favorite thing about being able to integrate with external APIs, and this is actually true for most of the code here. In this case, like you get the text message response from your API and you can debug like we did in real time. In Dark, you get the same experience for other functions like we were seeing. So this is actually the emoji application written in Dark, and I can look at a check-in and debug what has gone wrong with it. There's certain emojis that break, which is really interesting. And from this perspective, the ability to have this real-time feedback loop, whether it's around the APIs you're using, whether it's about the results of functions in your language, whether it's being able to see what would happen for a specific trace or debug a specific instance that you have, and being able to do that right away is actually the best way most of us learn. But right now, we think of those tools as being primarily for novices or people who are learning to develop. And so when we think about that, one of the really cool things about Glitch, if you haven't played with this yet, is you can go and you can build a JavaScript application, and then it just runs, and you can change it in real time. Like you can just go and edit the code, and then hit go, and it just works, and you can actually see what's happening. And one of the challenges we run into with backend systems today when you're sitting there is you write a bunch of code, and then you go through this deploy, or you build it locally, and you hope it works. But you have this long lag between when you do something and when you see the potential results. And I think one of the things that really removes complexity for people is not having to think about every single thing they're doing as they do it, because they're going to get the real-time feedback. So Glitch is one company that's doing that. Another one, if you just want to play with it, is Replit, where they spend a lot of effort on supporting a bunch of different languages, so you can get this real-time experience as you're writing software. And so that kind of breaks it down. I think when you think about the future of the entire software ecosystem, it's really exciting when we can get to a world where you're able to build with no accidental complexity whatsoever, and we can all build things in 10 minutes and then ship them to our users and be happy about it. That's, of course, not the world we're necessarily all living in today. If you're at a small company, maybe it is. If you're working on a side project, maybe it is. But for the rest of us, it's more about we're going to need to make incremental steps towards having this better developer experience and not wasting so much of our time doing the same things over and over again. 3 tenets of that will be this idea that for application developers, you will have this compiled infrastructure that just works for you instead of spending a lot of time thinking about it. You will be able to get this real-time feedback and not think about a 34-step deployment pipeline. It will work for you. And you'll be able to use APIs like functions. But when you're leaving the room and you're hanging out with each other tonight and you're talking about it, I hope you'll take away 2 things from this. The first is, when you are thinking of adding one of those many services from our cloud-native ecosystem, or something new to your deployment pipeline, or something new around connecting to external APIs, you'll think contextually about it and figure out what problem you're solving, rather than just thinking about, this is the cool new thing in our ecosystem. And then the second, and perhaps more important part of that, is every time you're thinking about adding something new to your infrastructure tooling, when you're adding it, ask yourself, is this removing some existing complexity from what I'm doing that will make developers better able to deliver software as we're building? And if that thing isn't removing complexity, ask yourself, is there something else from our tool chain that I'm going to be able to remove as a result of this to make sure I'm at least not adding to the complexity that our team is thinking about? So that's what I'll leave with you with today. I hope you had a great day at QCon, and thank you for being here.
We have time for some questions, if anybody wants. Let me know, and I'll run over to you with the mic. Oh, there we go.
If I want to get started using Darkly, is there any, is it talks or anything like that? Do you guys host any informational stuff to get started?
Currently, we're in private beta. And so the way to get access right now, honestly, the private beta things all come to me. So you're actually just talking to me. And what that is it's mostly about scoping the application that you want to build and making sure it's something that the platform supports effectively today. And I'd be happy to talk to you about that. Yeah.
My question is also based on what just C asked. So how do I get started, on Dark and few of the tools you just mentioned? How do I get started using it? Are all of them are open source? Especially, I'm more interested when you talked about the infrastructure thing. I was amazed how you have taken out almost 10 steps to deploy the application and get it immediately. So how do I more research on that and how it is happening without any deployment, container? Or I want to know more of that part.
Yeah. So I'll repeat it back and see if I'm getting it right. You're interested in more of how it actually works under the hood. And so from that perspective, what happens when you're writing code in Dark is when you're editing a specific expression. You're never editing just a small piece of text. It has some actual implication where we say, OK, we know what expression or what function you're adding to your code. We will deploy just that expression or just that parameter that you've added to that expression. And then what happens is that then goes through a very standard deployment process on our side. It's orchestrated using Kubernetes. It's hosted on Google Cloud. It's actually quite boring under the hood. The only interesting piece is the abstraction on top of it that allows you to not have to think about that.
You mentioned Google Cloud. Do you support AWS or Azure?
Oh, again, this is not a use Dark marketing talk. This is just I don't have another way to show all the things at once yet, which I hope other people build them too. Right now we don't. It's just on Google Cloud, just to scope what we're doing. There's no reason that someone couldn't build something like this or this couldn't be multi-cloud.
Hi. Quick question. So how does testing work with that, unit test, integration test, that kind of thing?
Yeah. When you saw the requests coming in for when I had an endpoint and you could see the live data, the idea would be that you would be able to save each of those incoming tests as a unit test if you specifically wanted to rerun that and have it automatically saved in that way. And then it's a general purpose language, so if you want to write other tests, you can.
Excuse me, sorry.
So this isn't about Dark itself, but in terms of reducing complexity and removing this stuff, how do you deal with developers or engineers just like not leaving well enough alone and always wanting to dig like a little deeper into something and always having that one piece that like this doesn't work exactly how I want it.
This is like half a CEO PM answer and half a just person who is an engineer answer. I think the thing that I found to be most effective in this case is weighing the actual trade-offs. And so like, yes, maybe this one piece isn't exactly right, but if you're getting 10x the time savings and giving up that one piece, that means you can deliver 10 times more stuff to your users, you can learn 10 times more new things. And I think it's always about framing the problem such that people can see the benefit in the context of the trade-off.
So I got this feeling it feels like the Visual Basic for Windows, and it was very easy for users to create like apps, but then it unleashed the whole mess that people are still trying to deal with it. Aren't you like a little bit scared of trying to create something like that again?
Yeah, yes. I think the reason I'm not scared is I think when I look at all of the choices we're making and the fact that we put a whole lot of very smart people in a room to try to talk about how we're going to have programmable infrastructure and like the future of infrastructure, I think it's that things have gotten to the point where the solution we're using probably isn't the right one and we have to come up with something else. And so when I look at that, I go, what is the coolest thing I can possibly imagine for where we could go and what would the best possible developer experience be and what would it take to be able to do that?
So with your feature flags and your elements, as you're promoting those from being behind a feature flag, do you have the ability to, like the observability and the metrics to look in to see what's being used from that standpoint, almost like an operational to define which code starts to, kind of fade out?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is actually a really great point, is while all of the infrastructure we're running on is accidental complexity that we have to do to be able to ship our systems, knowing how our systems are working and who is using them and how that works is really like essential to businesses, and people need to know what's going on. And so to that level of granularity with the feature flag, you can write completely custom logic for this is only for my name, or this is for this header, or this is for this set of alpha users, and then you would want to look at how that's working across that group before you make the decision to promote to the next one.
But do you just kind of flip them in, or how does, I mean, do you just say this is the default behavior for this action now, or for this
Yeah.
trigger?
Yeah.
Can you have multiple people work on the same code?
Oh yeah, this is like one of the things that's really a bummer is it's hard to demo when you're by yourself. The other thing that being live and deploying everything incrementally gets you is you can end up having a collaboration experience with developers on your team that is much more like a Google Docs-like experience where you can both be editing things and working on things in real time together rather than saying, I'm going to go off and build this thing and then come back with it. You can put those behind feature flags as well.
Okay. I think that's a wrap. I definitely appreciate Ellen. So another round of applause, please.